Thank you so much for having me. And I have so enjoyed listening in today. What a great way to spend a Sunday. Um, Thank you for having me. Thank you for arranging this. I have done a few of these or been in the background of a few of these myself, and I know the work that it takes and the dedication and the people involved. And I want to thank all of the people who were involved in getting this organized and the word out there and arranging some of us to be able to share today and participate in our own recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I am very grateful to be able to participate in my recovery today with you all. My name is Judith Roberts, and I am an alcoholic. And my sobriety date is January the 19th, 2009. So I'm just a baby at this. I just passed 11 and a half years, which to me is amazing because the last 4.5 to 5 years of my drinking, I was a daily drinker. Um, and I never uh, tried to stop in a way. And that's a little misleading when I say that because for the last several years of my drinking, every morning when I would come to, every single morning, I would say, not again, not again. I am not doing that again tonight. I'm a blackout drinker. I don't know what I've done and where I've been, who I've been with, and day after day after day, I would have to try and piece my life together. And there are many large, large gaps that I don't know. But every morning when I'd come to, I'd say, not again. And as soon as the clock started hitting around 4 p.m., that thought that would push aside all thoughts would come into my head. And it could be as simple as, that was a stressful day. I deserve a drink. Or it's Wednesday, I've been good for 2 days. Well, no, that's not true. I was never good for 2 days. I don't know. I'm so delusional to this point still. Whatever reason it was, it's Wednesday, it's Friday, it's whatever. And by 5:15, I would be just going to have one, just one. And I would be off and running again. Night after night after night after night, day after day after day after day. So for me to have 11 and a half years, number one, is quite shocking still to me. And even more shocking is the fact that I'm not only sober, but I'm happy about it. And those two things I could not imagine coexisting at the same time. My first year of sobriety, I went to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous every single day. I did not miss one. 8 p.m. every night, I was in my seat. But I refused to get a sponsor and I refused to work the steps because number one, it had that God word in the steps. And I'm here to talk about step 5, and I can tell you that God and my Father were number 1 and number 2 on my resentment list. My father has a doctorate of theology and was the president of a religious college, 4-year college in Australia. I was raised in Australia. My father's Australian. And so you can imagine having a father of theology that this has been pushed on me from the first moment of my life. And also my dad was violent in the home. And there was a secret and a persona that my family carried, where he was this published author and the president of a college and this big time theologian in Australia and in America and in Switzerland and all these places. And yet in the home, we saw a different side. And so God and my father is number 1 and number 2 on my resentment. So I come into AA and I, for some reason, felt the power in the meetings. And for 1 hour each day, I could breathe. For 1 hour each day, I had relief, but the other 23 hours were absolutely hell for me. And so I went to Alcoholics Anonymous for an entire year before getting a sponsor. And my untreated alcoholism almost killed me. It did, not drinking. From my first, I went to my first AA meeting intoxicated. That was on the 18th of January, 2009. So I don't count that as my sobriety date, obviously, because I was intoxicated. But so the next day, and I have not had a drink, and I have not had a drug. And part of my story is the last 4 years I went off the rails with cocaine, um, which took me down fast and hard, and I'm grateful for that. But I have not had any drug or alcohol since the 19th of January 2009. But because of these things, I was not willing to accept the spiritual program that you were all offering me. I kept coming back, but like I said, my untreated alcoholism took me to the gates of insanity and death, and I wasn't even drinking. And after about a year, it was 11 and a half months of me coming into Alcoholics Anonymous, I hit a second bottom, and I had a loaded pistol, and I was going to take my life. Sober, which I have heard the statistics are many of us do that sober, because I cannot handle life without a buffer between me and life. I need a solution, and my alcoholism demands to be treated. And it can be treated, as far as I know, either by taking a drink, which is a substitute for treatment, but it seems like relief at the time, that sense of ease and comfort at the time. It can also be treated by killing myself. I guess that would treat it. Or finally, I had to come face to face with what you were all offering me and the spiritual solution. So, after a series of events and my whole life imploding on itself in sobriety, and that's when I started experiencing all my outward external consequences, which I hadn't. I was experiencing internal consequences when I got sober, but it wasn't until a year into sobriety that I experienced external consequences, my past catching up to me. But through a series of events, my whole life imploded or exploded, or whatever you want to call it. My career, my life, everything basically drastically and dramatically changed. And I was plucked up from, and I believe now, through the divine intervention of this power that I despised and loathed, and I had this white hot rage against. But I believe that I was plucked out of where I was, because I don't think I would have stayed sober had I stayed there. Well, I'd be dead, because that's what I was planning, and transported me somewhere else into a very strong, big book community of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I walked into those doors, and they saw that I was dying of untreated alcoholism, and they surrounded me, and they got to work, and they appointed me a sponsor. And that sponsor then kicked me kicked my butt through the steps, and saved my life. And it has been amazing ever since. Not easy, but amazing, until today. I can say that I'm not only sober, but I am happy. And like I said, two things I didn't think could coexist. So yes, I have a sobriety date of January the 19th, 2009. I do have a sponsor, which I think is a vital tool. It is for me, to not only work the steps, but to daily now, I work the steps very quickly with my sponsor. And my sponsor is male. I know that that's somewhat controversial, and neither he nor I believe in that. But where I was transplanted, there were no women that were there to take people through the steps. So I was appointed a Harley mechanic who is mean and and serious about the big book, and serious about saving my life, and not caring about my feelings, which I needed at that point in time. But not only did he work the steps with me, but continues to guide me in this daily program, working the steps daily to the best of my ability. Helps me with my step 10s, helps me roll back and look at step 6 and 7, helps me with looking at my inventory in step 11, and also step 12 as I work all those daily. I love having a sponsor who knows they're my sponsor and who I interact with on a daily basis, or every other day, something like that, who leads me by example. I watch my sponsor and I watch how he lives. And he is a man of character and integrity. And thank goodness, otherwise, I would be dead today. I also have the privilege of sponsoring other women. That has become a very important tool and the highlight of my life. Someone who, as it's common to hear in AA, not a big fan of women when I come in here, competition and all of that. And so the fact that I now am surrounded by women who I care about, who I love, and who we walk together on a day-to-day basis, and it has become the bright spot of my life. I also, just one more thing before I roll into the fifth step, another tool that I have found to be vital in keeping me sober and happy is having a home group and a commitment in that home group. And I found that a home group where I belong is the best way for me to plug into the fellowship, and a very easy way for me to be of service and to fully participate in the fellowship aspect of Alcoholics Anonymous. So those things, my home group is on Thursdays at 7 p.m. if anyone wants to Zoom in. We go through the steps, the traditions, and the concepts. And we have fun doing it, even though it sounds a little boring. We have fun doing the traditions and the concepts. So that's a little bit about myself. Like I said, I am full blown, 100% dyed in the wool alcoholic. I from my very first drink, it wasn't something that was gradual and progressive with me. It was immediate and very quick, and it took me to hell, and that was bad. I mean, of course it was bad, but I also want to really emphasize that the year that I was dry or sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and not working the steps was in a way almost worse, because I could not handle life. I could not understand what was wrong. I had no comprehension of what the matter was. And when I was separated from alcohol, the only buffer I had, the only solution I had was removed from me. And now here I am, just absolutely every nerve ending, raw, naked, and exposed to the world. And I'm in constant pain. I am unraveling and coming apart at the seams. Well, I heard someone describe it once and it was so accurate. And I was like, yes, they get it. It's like being skinned alive. And that's how I felt. And I know to other people it may seem very dramatic, but those of you who have experienced it know exactly what I'm talking about. So I started, and everybody sort of, not sort of, everybody did a fantastic job leading up to this point to talk about the fifth step. And so I'm not going to recap on anything, and I don't have time to go into my story, but in working with my sponsor, I I was told to write my 4-step. That included 3 sections, of course, the resentment and fear and the sex part of it. And I had to understand a couple things before I even was willing to do this, to pursue it. And I had to, number one, in step one, I had to understand what alcoholism was. I had no clue what alcoholism was. My family, my parents, 85 years old, never had a drop of alcohol. I had never seen it in my home. I had never been around anyone that had drank. I was shipped off to boarding school at 13 in Australia, very controlled environment. I was never around it. Then I came to America and I got married. I was here to visit for a month, and in a month, I happened to meet a local farm boy in North Dakota. I was visiting my mom's side of the family, and within a month, I was engaged. And a couple months later, I was married to another very religious person who had never had a drop of alcohol. So it was nowhere in my existence. And I started late in life. My first drink was at 28 years old, which sounds really appalling these days because the women I work with start drinking at 11, 12, 13 years old. And it's like 28. I'm a little bit of a late bloomer, but from that moment, that day, everything fundamentally changed. Everything. It was an innocent drink. And from that moment on, it became my master. And I was a subject of King Alcohol, to use a phrase in the book. Within a year of that drink, I was excommunicated from the church, which again, you can understand why God would be number one on my resentment list. I was divorced. I was on my own. I was living in a spot and I was off to run. I was off and running. And I drank nonstop from 28 to 44 when I was separated from alcohol. And I did not really try to quit. So I didn't know anything about alcoholism. I didn't know anyone that had been to treatment, believe it or not. Now, all my friends have been multiple times. Um, I didn't know anyone. And I had already immediately surrounded myself with people who drank exactly like I was, because I lost everyone else, my family. I didn't lose them, I exchanged them. I served them up on a silver platter in exchange for alcohol. I got married in a second time in the middle of that and destroyed that marriage as well. I had 2 wonderful men that I was married to, and other wonderful relationships, and I destroyed absolutely every single one. Um, so when I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I didn't understand what alcoholism was. I thought it was some old dude, sorry guys, that lived under a bridge, homeless, and drank something mysteriously that's hidden in a paper bag. That was an alcoholic, not me. Not me. So I needed to understand what alcoholism was. You know, the I needed to understand the nature of alcoholism, the physical aspect, the mental obsession. I needed to see and understand how my life managed by me is not successful. I had to be convinced of that. I had to be convinced that there is something missing in my thinking, in my mind. Step two, the sanity needed to be returned, and I was told to look up the word sanity, and it means wholeness of thinking, wholeness, like with the WH, whole. And I didn't have wholeness of thinking. I had gaps in my thinking, gaps when it came to myself, gaps when it came to you, the world, a higher power. I had huge gaps in my thinking that needed to be restored because my perspective in life is always faulty because it's always from my perspective. I am Judith centered, not others centered. I am Judith centered, not God centered, whatever conception of God you have, not God centered. Everything revolves around Judith. I am the center of the universe rather than me falling into orbit with everybody else around this power that then I can have a successful life. I had to be convinced that there was something wrong, and only a power greater than myself could bring me back to wholeness of thinking. And then in step 3, I had to be convinced that I needed a new manager. I had to be willing to turn my thinking over to this powers thinking, my actions over to this powers actions. It wasn't just saying words. My sponsor says a decision not married with action is a fantasy. An intention not married with action is a fantasy. And so in my step 3, it wasn't just saying the words or saying a prayer, it was immediate action. And all my thinking needs to be redirected to this powers thinking, and every action, to the best of my ability, not perfect, but needs to be redirected to this powers actions, this powers will. And what is the powers, what is my primary purpose? At that point, at step 3, it was to fit myself in every way, to be of maximum service to my higher power and to those around me, or as I like to say, to God and God's kids. That's my primary purpose, and that's the only reason for my existence from now on. So that led me to the 4th step. And the 4th step, uh I had to do a lot of writing, and I was really good at the resentment part. Oh, one more thing I had to be convinced about, and yet I really wasn't going into the 4th step, was that self was my problem. That selfishness and self-centeredness is the root of my problems. I thought all of you were the root of my problems, or he was the root of my problems, or money was the root of my, anything but me. And so I was like, okay, sure, but I wasn't convinced. I was so unaware and asleep in my own life. I was never present. I was never connected. And so while I said, sure, okay, I can see that self is the root of my problems, I have to admit at this point in hindsight, looking back, that I was not convinced, but I did it anyway. And I enjoyed I enjoyed writing my resentment list, because I got to write down everyone's name that had ever done me wrong. And then I got to just spew out in the second column everything that they did wrong to me. I mean, bullet points. My sponsor is very firm. I don't want your life story, just bullet points. Thank you very much. And then I could even do the column 3. Of course, I know how it affected me. I have self loathing, zero self esteem. My finances are in disarray because it's my dad's fault or it's this person's fault. I have relationships galore because of this, that, and the other thing. I have fear, my security is threatened, all these things, right? I could do that, but I got stuck. I got very, very stuck on the 4th column. And I didn't even understand where the 4th column came from, because on page 65 in the example in our book, we only see 3 columns. And so I'm like, I'm like argumentative attorney, and I'm like, where's the 4th column? Being all smart aleck. And my sponsor pointed me to page 67, and halfway through the bottom of the page, it says, talks about the inventory is ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But when I got to the 4th column, I was very, very stuck, and I couldn't do it. And I'm going to focus on the resentment part right now. And if I have time, I would love to get into the sex part. I don't think I'll have time for all 3 parts of talking to my sponsor and doing my 5th step. And the 5th step really is all about the 4th column. And that was what I couldn't do. It's to admit to myself, to another, and to God, this higher power, the exact nature of my wrongs. Right? And that's the part I couldn't do. That's the part I couldn't see. I had nothing down for the 4th column, because it's like, I did nothing wrong. Sure, if you pin me down, I will say, well, I may have done this, but if he or she hadn't done that, I would never have done what I did. And besides, what I did was not anywhere near as bad as what they've done. So don't talk to me, about my mistakes, right? And I couldn't do it. And really, as far as what I've been taught in the big book is when we do our fifth step, this is what we're bringing to our sponsor. It's not necessarily the first, second, and third columns that we're needing addressing, because we've always done this inventory. We know this inventory very, very well. We review it all the time in our heads. I know exactly who's done me wrong. I know exactly what they've done, and I know how it affects me. I've always known that in my entire life. But that's not really what we're admitting in the fifth step. So it's like, I don't even know how to do the fifth step. I'm not capable of doing the fifth step because I can't bring the exact nature of my wrongs. I can't admit them to myself, to someone else, or to this power, this God. So what do I do? And it was a little frustrating. I'm sure more frustrating for my sponsor. But my sponsor said, fine, we shall do this together. And it was very, very helpful. And what I have found is that often with my own sponsees, because all I have to share is my experience, that this works really well with my sponsees. And first of all, I should have said that I am not an expert at anything, not the steps, not the fifth step, not Alcoholics Anonymous or anything like that. This is just my experience. And what I have found is I am brought sponsees that are very similar to me in many ways, and many of my sponsees also get very stuck on the exact nature of their wrongs. They get very stuck on the fifth step, just like me. And so this was very helpful to me because now I get to help them in doing theirs. So what happened was, when I went to do my fifth step, I brought my 3 columns, and of course my fourth and my sex conduct was half done. I needed help with that as well. I am just a slow learner when it comes to myself. I'm very quick to see what you all are doing, but I cannot see it about myself. So I brought my resentment, my 3 columns, sat down, and my sponsor prayed with me. And I love that. I love that my sponsor prayed, because I was really unable to pray, other than I did do the third step prayer, and that has continued to hold a lot of meaning for me. But to pray over that was just not something I was able to do. And so he prayed with me, and my sponsor prayed that that both of our hearts and minds would be touched, and that we would both be able to see things from a new way, that our hearts would both be open so that we could understand in a new way, and that we would both have the courage to look at what needed to be looked at. My sponsor invited this higher power to join us, and that's how we started the fifth step. And so what happened was, he said, give me your list. And I was like, what? I've never heard of this. I hear people talking in meetings all the time how they take the list and maybe go driving and they read the list to their sponsor and all. I was like, I didn't know I was going to have to turn this over. And he's like, give it over. So I turned my list over of my 3 columns and my resentment. And we went through them. He said, well, who's this? Like, say on the example on 65, there'd be Mr. Brown. Well, who's Mr. Brown? Oh, it's your coworker. Okay. And he took a little bit of notes so that he would have an understanding of who the players were and what was happening in my life. And also, I didn't know this, but he was writing down patterns that he was seeing in me, like some character defects. But he was just taking some notes. And when we were finished just reviewing the first 3 columns, just lightly touching on them, giving him new information if he needed new information, he told me to open up my book to page 65. And he read the first line after the example. And the first line says, we went back through our lives. And he said, that's what you've just done. We started from here, what is eating your lunch now? What is the most, let's go here now with what's bothering you the most and work backwards till you run out of steam the younger you get. We're not going to start at kindergarten and move forward. You're never going to get it done. But so that was the instruction he gave me. And we went back through my life. And he said, we just did that. And then he said, the next line, nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. And my sponsor stopped at every line and he said, do you believe you've been thorough? And to the best of your ability, have you been honest in what you've written down here? And I was like, yep, you bet. They all did that, and that's the truth. And I'm being thorough and I'm being honest. You bet. Then the next line he read, and he says, when we were finished, we considered it carefully. And in my book, I have a little one there because it's interesting how many times we're going to turn back to this list. And this is the first time that we're going back to the completed list. So I have a little one by when we were finished, we considered it carefully. And my sponsor and I had just finished considering it carefully. We went through the first 3 columns. And then the next line said, and he just marched through this, he said the first thing that's apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. And my sponsor stopped and he said, Judith, when I look at this, it is quite apparent. And he wasn't being sarcastic, and there were tears in his eyes. It is quite apparent that these people and the world were quite wrong. I had things on there. I had real trauma. Real trauma. I had a violent father. I had been, physically abused. I had been abandoned. I had been shunned, excommunicated from the church. I had been assaulted a number of times in boarding school. I had been at 15 for a year and a half sexually assaulted by a staff member. My niece at 7 years of age had been killed. There were real resentments and real trauma. And what I appreciated was my sponsor never diminished it. Never once was I told that I was wrong, that these things weren't true, that they weren't painful. Not once. And it was such a relief. I was expecting to defend and have to defend my position of this is real, this hurt, this is wrong, that guy should be in jail that did that to me, this person sexually, the funny thing is in my life after that, because of, and it became apparent later, I kept putting myself in situations where I was victimized again and again and again because that first one was never resolved. And I'm like, these men were wrong. And I had someone sitting across from me, my sponsor, that said, it is quite apparent that these people were wrong. And he asked me if I had ever been to a therapist. And I said, you bet. I've been to a couple. Now, granted, I was drinking the entire time and not telling them that little part of the story, but I went to a therapist, and so they weren't really able to help me. I do believe in outside help, but they were not able to help me because what my real fundamental problem was at that point was alcoholism. And I never told them about it. And they were quite unprepared to be able to address something that they didn't even know about. But when I would tell them about these things, these traumas in my life, what I heard, now I don't know if this is true or not, but what I heard in my haze of active alcoholism was, you have every right to be angry. That's what I heard. You have every right to be angry. And you know what? I was. I took that as permission. And I was angry. And for the rest of my life, my entire life, I was angry, and it justified everything I did. Anything I messed up with, anything I did wrong, it was their fault because this happened to me. Anytime I mistreated one of you, especially men, it was, y'all deserve it anyway. Now, none of this is conscious. It's all subconscious. Although at times I would specifically tell men, do not get involved with me. You do at your own risk because, and don't come crying to me if you get hurt. If you can't run with the big dog, stay on the porch because you're just here for my pleasure. That's it. So anytime I would hurt someone or anytime in a relationship, and I walked away from two wonderful marriages and many other wonderful people, and I'd be like, your fault. I warned you, right? I stayed angry. And the next line he said, my sponsor pointed out on top of page 66, it said, to conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. Boom. That was me. That's as far as I ever got, and I stayed there. And what usually happens, exactly what the book says, the usual outcome is that people continue to harm me. I put myself in harm's way. And I continue to stay sore, as the book says, and what I translate sore as meaning is pissed off. I am a ball of rage, although I come across very sweet and very manipulative, because you can get more with honey. You can attract more bees with honey than with vinegar. And I would manipulate, and I would use that, and I would use my sexuality, and that all became clear in the sex inventory, maybe, and I doubt we're going to get to it. But my sponsor continued on, and he said, you have every right to be angry, just like the therapist said. But he said, now what? Now what? Do you want to stay angry? And at that point, I was like, no, I'm so exhausted. I'm so exhausted. And I don't know how to successfully live this life. And to me, success is defined by having some peace and some happiness and some joy. I could not feel love at this point. If I was drunk, I would tell you I loved you. But I could not feel love, nor could I give love, honestly. That wasn't a transaction. That's all I understood love was. And I was so tired. And I needed to get rid of these things. So we went down a little further on page 66, and it said we turned back to the list. So I have a little number 2 by that paragraph, because this is the second time we're going back to this silly list. And it says we turn back to the list, for it held the key to the future. I'm like, how does this pile of crap, excuse my language, hold the key to my future? And then my sponsor read the next line, we're prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. And he looked at me and he said, are you ready to look at it from an entirely different angle? And he said, what that angle is any angle but yours. Well, that's a new concept, because all I'm used to is looking at it from my perspective. That's the only thing I'm capable of. And my perspective is very, very skewed. Like I said, very Judith-centered, right? And anything I do is justified, excused, rationalized, defended. I'm pretty good at my job, and I can end up talking you into apologizing to me for something I did to you. Just saying, right? Anything I'm very good at spinning things, right? So I have to look at it from a different perspective, and that is anything other than my own. And my sponsor read another line here, and it said, we began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. And he said, look at those people on the first column. He said, those people are dominating you, and you haven't even had any interaction with them for decades. They dominate you on where you go, what you do, how you think about yourself, how you think about men, how you think about women, how you think about power and possessions and prestige, and how you hustle nonstop for worthiness. They're dominating you. You think you're so independent, and yet you are dominated by these people that you are no longer even having a day-to-day interaction with. And you're living your life, and you aren't even aware that this is what is driving you. And this is why you're hustling for worthiness nonstop. This is why you're exhausted. You are dominated by this list, by these people. My sponsor said they must be mastered, but how? And that's true. I went to therapists. I bought every self-help book. I've tried absolutely everything I can, and I could never fix myself. And so I was stuck. And then we went on the bottom of page 66, and he said, "This is our course. The book tells us exactly what to do. You're stuck and you're angry and you're exhausted. When they say you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, on my fifth step, I was there. It wasn't just coming into Alcoholics Anonymous, it was in sobriety for me. This is my course. I realized that the people who had wronged me were perhaps spiritually sick. This is a new idea for me." And my sponsor said, "Look at the first column," and said, "Can you find anyone on that first column that you would classify as being spiritually healthy?" And I looked at that list, and there wasn't anyone that I could identify as being spiritually healthy. He said, "In your book, write column 1 over it's the second line, second last line on page 66. The people who wronged us. That's column 1. Write that in your book. Remember that. All that column 1 is a list of spiritually sick people." And then on the top of page 66, he said, "Look at your column 2. All what you wrote in column 2 are symptoms of sickness. It's nothing personal towards you. Can you find anything on there that isn't symptomatic of a spiritual sickness?" So in my book, I wrote column 2 over on the top line of 67, where it talks about their symptoms. And all of a sudden it occurred to me. And then it says, "We did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us." And I have a little column 3 over disturbed us. And this works really well, not to bring up a touchy subject of today, because he used something different, but I think today I can use this, and it would be the same as if I said, "Okay, write COVID-19 on column 1. That's a sickness. What are the symptoms of COVID-19? Write that in column 2. Well, fever, sore throat, trouble breathing, all this stuff. That would be in column 2. Column 3, how does it disturb me? Isolation, feeling very sick, possible death. How is that any different from the list of the people's names, their symptoms, and how they disturb us? I needed that illustration of a physical sickness so I could not take it all personally. Here's a spiritually sick person. Here are their symptoms that have nothing to do with me, but they are symptoms of them being sick. And their sickness spills out on me in column 3 and disturbs me. Same as anything. It could be diabetes, it could be COVID, it could be cancer, it could be anything. I could have that if I want to get a visual of this so I can understand it a little bit better. That's in my first column. What are the symptoms of that physical illness and how do they do? It's just that their sickness is spilling over on me. That helped me start. That helped me start to get a different perspective other than my own, which is they're out to get me. Everyone's out to get me. And it's all very personal. So then came the hard part. And he skipped down. So I got to see that, right? But I'm still waiting for that fourth column. And here's the tricky bit, and I don't want to get all controversial. Remember, this is just my experience. But like I mentioned, I had some things on my list. Being sexually abused at boarding school, having a violent father, having my niece murdered, not murdered, killed. It wasn't classified as murder. Sorry. a lot of other things, right? And I had heard in meetings about looking for our part. And that would make me see red every single time. Because I'm sorry, I'm a child and I'm being sexually abused by a staff member, a grown up at a boarding school. What part do I have in that? And I still get a little bit like the hairs on the back of my head because I deal with a lot of women who have been sexually abused and molested from being toddlers on up. I work with women who have been raped. I work with women who have been dreadfully traumatized. And I am so grateful that I had a sponsor who knew the book because I was waiting for him. I was like waiting in the weeds because I was at this point going to rip into him, tear him apart, and storm out and leave AA. I was waiting for him. I was giving him a chance to let's go through this fourth and fifth, but I was sort of waiting for an excuse of why this program wasn't going to work for me. And this was it. As soon as he said, well, now let's look for your part. I, pardon? Oh man. I thought I set my timer. All right. Well, let me just finish with this. He didn't say that because nowhere in the book does it say anything about our part. We don't have a part in many, many things that are done to us. That's not the point. The point is it says, what were our mistakes? And not even in that event, but moving forward, how did I take what had happened to me and then how did I live? And how did I compound the mistakes and how I lived my life? And he had a list from that was published in the Grapevine back in the 40s, I believe. And if you want that list, let me know. But it takes the words selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and afraid, and it breaks down those into workable definitions that I could understand because I could not see where I was selfish, dishonest, frightened, or self-seeking in these situations. So thank goodness he went and followed the book and helped me work through that. And for the first time, when he got out these definitions of what those mistakes actually were, I could see how I had been operating in life. I could see it from a different perspective. I could see it for what it was. And just in closing, we ended with the resentment part. When I finally could write down my fourth column with his help, where was I expecting and or wanting someone to be different than what they were, how they were capable, how I was expecting these spiritually sick people to be different. All these things. I could do my fourth step with my sponsor's help. And then at the very end, at the bottom, right before the fear inventory, it says, we admitted these wrongs honestly, and I was absolutely able to admit my wrongs honestly, my mistakes honestly in that fourth column. And then it says, we're willing to set these matters straight. And my sponsor asked me, are you willing to set these matters straight? And I said, yes. And he took me back up to the top of the page 67 and we did that prayer. And that prayer, I was told, is not for the other person. That prayer is for me, that I get a new vision, a new approach, that I'm saved from anger, that I find a way to help that person, that I see that person in a new way. That entire prayer is not for them. It's for me, so that I get a new idea, a new approach, and I finally get set free from how I was always living my life. Thank you for giving me this life and for letting me participate.